Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded short presentation on understanding and implementing the SEND Code of Practice. This course covers education, health and care needs assessments and plans. My name is Jo Haines and I'm a senior educational psychologist with the local authority. Moving on. The purpose of the course is so that by the end of the session you will know about the guidance in the Code of Practice in relation to EHCs, know about the local context, and know how to make a request for an education, health and care needs assessment. The information I'm about to share with you today arises from key pieces of documentation that need to be followed in settings. The two key pieces of overarching legislation are the Children and Families Act 2014 and the Equality Act 2010. On the next 3 slides, you see highlighted the requirements in relation to schools, early years settings and further education settings in terms of meeting the needs of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice refers to school settings, Chapter 4 to early years settings, and Chapter 7 to further education settings. Summarising, across all of these different settings, there is an emphasis on the use of a 4-part cycle called the Assess, Plan, Do, Review cycle. The cycle enables provision to be made that is matched to the child through a process of refining and revising through regular reviews and planning. An emphasis is placed on all settings to use what is termed their best endeavours to meet needs. The overall approach to meeting special educational needs and disabilities is called the graduated approach, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. I will leave you to read through the slides here in your own time. In order to support local settings, Bradford has provided guidance on how settings, schools and colleges can meet the needs of children and young people within the context of a graduated approach. It provides descriptors of learner characteristics from below age-related expectations through to the red and pink coloured sections where typically pupils would have more severe and complex needs and require education, health and care plans and sometimes specialist provision. All 4 areas of need are described, including communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health needs, and physical and sensory needs. Alongside the descriptions of need are expectations as to what schools should be putting in place in terms of provision, and this is based on the severity and complexity of need. Schools should use their delegated funding to meet the needs of pupils up to SEND support. I've included a link there for reference to the documentation. It's available on BSO. I'm moving on to look at what the code says about when an education, health and care needs assessment might be necessary. This slide here is taken from Chapter 9 of the Code of Practice, which is a specific chapter related to education, health and care needs assessments and plans. Chapter 9 clearly states that the majority of children will have their needs met within their local mainstream early years setting, school or college. However, Some children may require an EHC needs assessment in order for the local authority to decide if it needs to make provision in accordance with an EHC plan, i.e. does the child's needs require and provision require something beyond that which would normally be expected to be provided in a school or setting. Chapters 5, 6 and 7 of the Code contain the specific guidance for earlier settings, schools and colleges relating to when they might consider making a request for an education, health and care needs assessment. Again, I will leave you to look through these last couple of slides in your own time. So, when should a local authority carry out an education, health and care assessment? Essentially, there are just two questions which need to be answered, and these are detailed here. An authority should carry out an education, health and care assessment if it is of the opinion that a child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made for the child or young person in accordance with an EHC plan. This is from section 36(8) of the Children and Families Act. So, as you can see, in a nutshell, there are just two questions that need to be answered. Does the child or may the child have special educational needs, and do they require special educational provision in accordance with a plan? As we have seen earlier, the guidance from the matrix of need indicates the type of special educational need and provision that is likely to require a plan in the four areas. This slide here contains some important information, which I will leave you just to read for a moment or two. Okay, so this is where the local authority will be requesting evidence from you, from the settings, about the young person or child and their needs, and the evidence about what has already been put in place and how this has impacted on a child or young person's progress. Essentially, what has been done and what impact has this had? Further guidance is contained in Chapter 9 of the Code of Practice about the evidence local authorities will consider when making decisions about whether to undertake an EHC assessment. In summary, this will relate to evidence of academic progress, information about a child or young person's special educational needs, evidence of what action has already been taken, evidence of progress that has been made, evidence relating to a young person's physical, emotional and social development and health needs, information from other agencies, and in the case of pupils over 18, whether they require additional time in order to complete their education or training. I'd just like to draw your attention to section 9.16 of the Code of Practice. This section states that the local authority may develop criteria as a guidance to help them decide when it is necessary to carry out an EHC needs assessment. This is what Bradford Local Authority has done in providing guidance within the matrix of need and the SENCO guidance documentation. However, the code does make it clear that local authorities must be prepared to depart from those criteria where there is a clear and compelling reason to do so. Essentially, local authorities must not apply a blanket policy to particular groups of children or certain types of need. Having said that, the two tests as laid down in the Code of Practice will still clearly need to apply. And these, as we have heard earlier, relate to the evidence as to whether a child may have special educational needs and whether they will require provision in line with an EHC assessment. This means that irrespective of the local criteria, evidence will still need to be presented which demonstrates these two key tests or questions, or rather answers these key tests or questions. On this slide, you can see that there is sometimes exceptions to the requirement to provide evidence gathered over time within the context of graduated response. For some children, for example, it is very clear that they have significant needs and complex difficulties, and these have been identified at birth or very early. So it is appropriate then that provision, if needed through an EHC plan, is put in place in a timely way. Another example might be if a learner moves into an authority and it is quite clear and evident that their needs are significant. Sometimes for children newly arrived in the country, it is evident that they have a high level of need and require provision of an EHC. And sometimes children can have a sudden change or loss in functioning as a result of injury or illness that requires a high level of provision to be put in place. In the main, though, the expectation is that school settings will meet needs through the graduated approach. So on this slide here, you see a few notes of caution to you as practitioners. The local authority is only able to make a decision based on the information it receives. It's important that you provide the correct information and depth of information to enable them to make a decision. In Bradford, the information that is required is captured in the EHC request form, which I've included a link to there and again is available on BSO. We'll have a look at this sections of the request form in a few moments. What the local authority essentially needs is a clear picture of the child, young person's needs, what has been done to support the child already, and what the likely need and provision is going forwards. We'll now have a look at the evidence and information that is required. So you need to provide evidence which indicates whether the child has needs in one or more areas of the Code of Practice. As referred to earlier, the matrix of needs provides guidance and descriptions of learner characteristics. You will need evidence from school assessment and progress data, and evidence of professional involvement. You will need to provide evidence of a graduated response in the majority of circumstances. The involvement of parents and carers is important, and this is a theme that runs through the Code of Practice. School documentation should be person-centred and the involvement of key people clearly visible within documentation clearly submitted. You'll need to demonstrate that there have been cycles of assess, plan, do, review. And I've included there a link to the My Support Plan documentation for reference. Some schools may be using different forms of documentation and plans. However, the type of information contained in the My Support Plan is relevant and appropriate. At this point, I would just like to say a little bit about the funding. Schools have a delegated amount of funding to meet the needs of pupils with SEND, and there is also pupil premium funding available to schools. There's an early years inclusion fund available for some pupils in the early years also. Schools and settings need to be transparent and clear about how this funding is used within the context of a graduated response and what provision has been put in place. Essentially, you need to demonstrate how you've used your existing funding to implement provision and meet need. Otherwise, it's not clear to the authority whether additional funding is required. Here, you can see information from the SENCO handbook about the type of intervention and provision that should be in place at SEN support. Along with, of course, a high quality teaching and quality first teaching that is referred to in the earlier stages of the documentation. On this slide here, you see the type of additional provision that is in line with an EHCP plan. Essentially, in order to meet the requirements for the additionality of an EHC plan, a child will require additional provision, usually defined in adult support, amounting to between 19 and 24 hours of support per week. This might comprise of one-to-one and small group support to facilitate curriculum access and deliver specific programs of work. You should be able to demonstrate this provision is in place through school documentation, or that this provision is needed and required through documentation such as the My Support Plan that has already been discussed. Here on this slide, I make reference to the requirement to seek specialist advice and support. This is from section 6.58 of the Code of Practice and 6.59. Note, on this slide, again, you can read it in your own time, in more detail, I've indicated that it's not just about having one-off assessments and standalone reports. What you need to do is demonstrate how you have acted upon the recommended advice that has been provided by specialists, and perhaps evidence or certainly evidence this within your documentation, such as your My Support Plan. For example, if you've had an assessment by the Cognition and Learning team, you need to demonstrate how you have included that advice within the provision that is made available for pupils. In the next few slides, we will look at the actual request form that is available on Bradford Schools Online. Starting at the beginning of the form, there are some really basic things that you will need to do. Please ensure that you have signed consent from the parent, carer, or corporate parent in the case of children in care. And also, with pupils 16 and over, consent from the pupils themselves. Make sure you complete sections 1A, B, C, and D fully. This will facilitate contacting people as required. Make sure that you do include the views of the child and young person, and ensure 3B is completed with parents and carers. It's important to include the short and long-term aspirations for the children and young people. These aspirations should be a recurring theme through the document. So when you are setting appropriate outcomes, there should be some link to the aspirations. It's called the golden thread. Make sure that you provide attainment data over a 2-year period to demonstrate impact of any progress and provision. Again, if it is a request for pupils in exceptional circumstances, as we've already discussed, then you may not be able to provide that period of data. And if a child has moved schools, sometimes that can be more difficult to track and trace. So essentially, provide what you can. And if a pupil has been through your school for a number of years, then you will have that data to hand. Make sure you provide reasons if a child's attendance is lower than expected, and also what you might have done to improve the attendance. Sections 5, 5B relate to describing the child and young person's special educational needs. You'll need to include a summary of their special educational needs, strengths, emerging skills, and barriers. I've included some examples of each for your reference here. So the summary of SEND should be a relatively brief summary because you will be putting the detail into the other relevant sections of the document. Include a description of strengths for each area, for example, cognition and learning, communication and interaction, SEMH needs, and physical and sensory needs. So you must include the strengths. Note that emerging skills are those that are in their infancy and areas for consolidation and development. These are the skills which are yet to develop, but there is the potential to do so. Barriers are the learning needs or difficulties. A barrier does not have to link always to an emerging skill. So here we see one here. So a clear barrier for Maria is the fact she has a profound hearing loss, and that is a barrier to her accessing the curriculum. It's important you complete all sections relating to strengths in each area. However, if a child or young person does not have a barrier to learning in a specific area, then you don't complete that section. For example, a child might have significant barriers in relation to their physical needs, but none in terms of cognition. Also, it's really important that for those pupils from year 9 onwards, that we have a link to preparing for adult outcomes, and that section is completed alongside the other sections. So I've included some examples of PFA outcomes, strengths and barriers relevant to the older pupil. So section 6 relates to the outcomes and provision. And for reference, section 9.66 of the Code of Practice defines what an outcome is. Ideally, so you may want to look up this at a later point. Ideally, in summary, there should be long-term outcomes, medium and short-term outcomes. Longer-term outcomes tend to indicate the direction of progress or travel for a young person and should link towards aspirations, as we've already discussed earlier. They tend to be broader and overarching. Using phrases such as so that and in order to is useful when writing longer-term outcomes, as it enables them to link to a purpose or a goal. Medium-term outcomes are an interim step towards the long-term outcomes, usually to be achieved by the following year, with the shorter-term outcomes being a shorter time period and creating steps on the way to those medium-term outcomes. It's important that outcomes are SMART, specifying dates, outcomes to be achieved by, and again, that they link to some long-term aspirations. In section 6, you'll also need to detail the provision you are making. I've included some key points that you need to consider when detailing the provision, so I will leave you to look at that again in your own time. So, to summarise though, it's important that provision is detailed and specific in terms of what interventions or specific strategies are in place, what equipment and resources you are using, and you need to be clearly quantifying in terms of frequency, hours, duration, the level of support which is being put in place. You need to indicate whether it's individual support or group support, who will deliver it and what level of expertise is required. It's only through providing this information that the local authority will understand the extent of a child or young person's needs and the provision required to meet those needs. I think you do need to consider the individual and group support carefully, because sometimes it can be that a child takes part in a group intervention, for example, a social use of language group, as part of a group of 6 pupils, maybe twice a week for half an hour. So that would be a clear and defined group intervention. However, that contrasts perhaps with when a child is actually receiving one-to-one support within the context of a smaller group in class. If the child themselves is requiring that level of one-to-one support, even though they may be in that group, then the support is given individually to that child, and that is defined as one-to-one support. I hope I've made that clear. So essentially, yes, they are part of a group, but the support is for that child because they require that level of support within a small group context. What more do I need to say there? I think we can move on. On section 7, I've included the details of what needs to be covered under section 7, the health needs. Don't just focus on diagnostic labels. It's about how the healthcare needs relate to a young person or child's special educational needs. For example, a child with cerebral palsy, that might have an impact on their stability and ability to walk distances, and also motor control when handwriting. Self-care needs may also be impacted. So it's really clear to ensure that you make that link. Section 8 relates to social care needs, and it's important that section is completed if relevant. For example, it could be a child has support to develop social skills or independence in the community. I've highlighted also that at the end of this, you need to complete the rating scale that is there on the documentation. Okay, so finally, I've come to the conclusion of the presentation, I don't have a lot of time left on this video. It will automatically cut out very shortly. So if it comes to a sudden end, just to warn you, we only get half an hour of the WebEx time. So basically, make sure you include evidence of a graduated approach. This could be through your My Support plan. Provide provision maps to highlight frequency of support and costing analysis, and make sure you include any professional advice that you have drawn upon. At the bottom there, I have produced, I have linked, I put a link into the EHC request form. Here on the next couple of slides, and you can read through in your own time, is a little bit about what happens next when you have submitted your request. With some links and references for you there. So, thank you for listening. Unfortunately, this is a recorded presentation and there aren't any times, any opportunities for questions. But thank you for listening,